Well, welcome back, everybody, or welcome if this is your first time to the Social Contract Research Seminar for the second of our 4 meetings this semester. Our topic tonight is the concept of trust. Trust is the key condition for a healthy social contract, and it's also a theme that's been much in the news in recent weeks. For those of you watching this seminar as a video in the future, um, first of all, if you could let us know what the future would be like, that would be really helpful. Thank you. But secondly, just to fill you future dwellers in, just last week, as we record this seminar, Donald Trump imposed punitive import tariffs on over 100 countries, and nobody's quite sure yet how that's going to work out. The question of who we can trust and who we must trust is a very live issue on the world stage at the moment, not least in Europe, from where our speaker today will address us, and from here in Australia, where I'm speaking from. These are all questions that I'm sure our speaker today will decisively clarify once and for all, leaving us in no doubt. And in anticipation of this, I'm delighted to introduce him now. Thomas Simpson is the Alfred Landecker Professor of Values and Public Policy at the Blavatnik School of Government in the University of Oxford. His research focuses on trust, freedom, and ethical issues related to public policy. And in 2023, his monograph entitled Trust, a Philosophical Study was published by Oxford University Press. I also had the pleasure of knowing Tom as an undergraduate, and I can attest that he is indeed a trustworthy and thoroughly nice person. The title for today's seminar is Cultures of Trust. So would you please join me in welcoming our speaker for this session, Professor Thomas Simpson.
So, Chris, thank you very, very much for the warm and generous introduction. And it's actually overly generous, and that's not just due humility, but I only take up the position of the Alfred Landecker Chair this summer as well. So it's so the news is out, but I'm still kind of acclimating, as it were, to being able to accept those terms. But thank you very much. And it's terribly bad form to start with an apology at the start of a seminar, but I do need to start with that, which is that I am actually on holiday right now, and I'm kind of breaking that to come in to engage in this discussion, which I'm very much looking forward to. And so, if my head is just kind of getting into gear, as it were, in the workspace, do please forgive me for that. So. What I thought I'd do is just present some material from my recent book, but adapted slightly to connect with the themes of the seminar around the social contract, and what I take to be the heart of questions around the social contract, which is what are the very fundamental bases for cooperation and for social order in a society of, roughly speaking, free and equal people. So what I want to do is talk a bit about cultures of trust in connection with the rule of law, specifically for that. So I haven't got any slides. I'm just going to talk for 25 minutes or so, and then we'll look forward to discussion after that. Okay, so what's the central thesis that I'm going to argue for is the following: that there is a reciprocal reinforcing relationship between compliance with the law and a culture of trust. So specifically, the normative principles which uphold compliance with the law, plus the fact of widespread compliance, provide key premises and principles for normative practical reasoning that also upholds cultures of trust, and the reversed. Now, why is this claim that there should be this relationship between a culture of trust and a rule of law, a reciprocally reinforcing relationship? Why is that interesting? Well, I think it's not surprising that compliance with the law should promote, on the other hand, a culture of trust. But I think it is interesting and controversial that the reverse should be the case, that a culture of trust itself supports compliance with the law. And if that's the case, it looks like there's a kind of, not an absolute priority, but nonetheless an essential privileging of trust, cultures of trust in securing the conditions of social order. And why should this be controversial? Well, there's those of us, I don't know if we have economists in the room, but in the Zoom room, but there's a long-standing tradition within economics of seeking to structure marketplace transaction and indeed social transactions in a way that, quotes, economizes on virtue, so that incentives become a substitute for trust. And I suppose the thrust of the argument is that there's an in principle shortfall here, that there's kinds of virtue which actually are essential for sustaining social order. And I think the thesis also has normative implications. So we may hopefully get into this towards the end. But if the economizing on virtue thought is correct, then while we may start in society with, if you like, a stock of virtue, we'll come to a place where we can, as it were, kick away the ladder, and we can just do without civic virtue. But conversely, if that thought is not correct, then promoting and sustaining social trust will be a distinct goal of policy and law. And I think that's very significant. And I'll relate that to questions of justice as well, which are standardly taken, particularly by political philosophers, to be the primary goal of policy and law. Okay, so let me get into the thesis. So I should start by just explaining what I mean, in particular by a culture of trust. So a culture of trust is different from a social environment in which trust can reliably be placed well. So we can imagine a situation in which we're able to discriminate between the trustworthy and the untrustworthy in a reliable way, and then place trust only in the trustworthy, or maybe there can be some exceptional circumstances in which we trust the untrustworthy, but in general, we're seeking the rational thing to do is to trust the trustworthy. And a culture of trust is not that, it's more demanding than that. So in a culture of trust, I think trust is a rational default attitude for a suitably wide set of interactions. And when I say wide, I mean wide in terms of scope and significance. And the intuitive way of putting this would be the locked door test. So some people will say, in my neighborhood or neighborhood I used to live in or something like that, we left our doors unlocked. You could trust people. And so this idea that you could just leave your doors unlocked, the rational default thing to do is just to leave your doors unlocked. It takes a little bit of time to lock them, to close them. You have to remember where your keys are and so forth. In some social environments, this is totally rational not to do so, and in other social environments, regardless of the laws against theft and so forth and breaking and entering, nonetheless, it's rational to lock your door. And so this just gives us an illustration of a kind of domain of interaction, if you like, and we can think about more expansive domains of interaction, more restricted domains of interaction. And according to that set of domains of interaction, that set in which there's a rational default attitude of trust is one in which there is a culture of trust by definition. So culture of trust is when there's a wide set, wide in terms of scope and significance, and there's no such culture of trust in the converse. And clearly we can see that cultures of trust come in degrees as a result of this. Now, why would trust be a rational default attitude in that set of interactions? Well, I think the answer is it's sustained by embedded norms of trustworthiness. So Chris very generously declared me to be trustworthy. I don't know whether he's correct or not about that at the start. But I think that's a very precise comment, that if one's holding someone up for praise, then it's their trustworthiness rather than their habits of trust, which are the first thing which we might go to and think about what it is to be virtuous in a trusting context. And clearly, trustworthiness is mandated. There are social norms which mandate this, which require us, create expectations on us that we should be trustworthy. We take these norms to be widely endorsed, internalized by a wide number of other people, and to be enforced on others, enforced on non-compliers in particular. And they're embedded when they are just widely followed, widely endorsed, and widely enforced. So what are these norms of trustworthiness? Well, they require that one should fulfill one's commitments robustly. And so just for those working in the philosophy of trust literature, I'm not going to engage in the definitional question of what trust consists in here, but just as a first pass, I'm roughly speaking working with Catherine Hawley's commitment-based account of trust, where what it is to trust someone, it's a necessary condition on that trust that someone else should be committed to do something. And we can say more about this in discussion, obviously. So a norm of trustworthiness requires that one fulfills one's commitments robustly across a variety of ways that the world could go. And these norms principally work by being internalized, but must also be enforced on free riders. And these norms of trustworthiness therefore have an ideational content. They have there's not just some empirical facts which ground them about the proportions of people who internalize them, the proportions of people who comply with them, the proportions of people who enforce them on non-compliers. But they also have, as well as those facts, there's a set of ideational facts about these norms. And I just want to highlight three elements of these norms of trustworthiness. So firstly, they're trumping. And what I mean by that is that they rise to the top of the priority order in terms of one's practical reasoning. So if one has committed to do something, I've committed to turn up for this seminar. The fact that I could be sitting by the beach is not a sufficiently, and I would enjoy that. That's not a sufficiently good reason not to do so. The fact that I've made that commitment trumps other preferences that I may have. It's also deontic. So it's deontic in the sense that it obliges me to comply with them. And this contrasts with commitments which give one reason to fulfill them. So it's true that in taking on a commitment, I thereby have reason to fulfill that commitment. But there's a stronger claim, which is also true, which is that I'm obliged to fulfill that. And particularly if it was merely reasons, then I would be engaged in a situation where I'd be counterbalancing, considering the weight of reasons that I have to act for one reason, the weight of reasons that I have to act for another reason. Whereas a deontic demand excludes that kind of weighing of reasons. In parenthesis, we should note that obviously there can be conflicts between one's obligations, and so something like that weighing may have to take place at that time. But nonetheless, it's in the first instance, it stands above that weighing process. It also creates, thirdly, a universal demand. So I'm required to fulfill my commitments to anyone to whom I make those commitments. I don't get special kind of carve-out clauses for particular individuals or particular kinds of people that exempt me from complying with my commitments. I'm required to comply with my commitments for anyone who is properly able to claim those commitments. And as a result of this, all of this enforcement of norms of trustworthiness is normatively justified. So it's not just a psychological fact that we feel resentment at people who break their commitments, and we feel entitled to impose some kind of cost, some kind of punitive cost on them as a result of doing so, whether that's a kind of direct material punishment, whether it's an expressive punishment, whether it's a sense of disapprobation for their actions. But actually that psychological fact of a sense of resentment is normatively justified at those who've broken their commitments. And so norms of trustworthiness have this self-reinforcing quality about them. And then a final condition on a culture of trust is that norms of trustworthiness must have legitimacy, specifically ideational legitimacy. So that is that they must be popularly regarded as proper claims, proper demands on one's action. And when this is the case, those who view trustworthiness as a conditional obligation are subject by their own lights to that obligation. So what do I say? What do I mean by this? I think there's many people who say something like, I'll comply with this norm only if other people also comply with that. So it's if others comply, then I will comply. Conversely, if others don't comply, then I won't comply. Effectively, tit for tat, a kind of basic principle of reciprocity. And I think quite what the proper status of norms of trustworthiness is a quite deep question, which actually I'm not going to defend an answer to here as to whether they're unconditional or conditional. And certainly many people would regard them as unconditional. But I think for a very significant proportion of people, the idea that norms are conditional is a really important feature of their the way they conceptualize the practical demand that arises in those norms. And as a consequence, it's required for a norm of trustworthiness to be stable, for it to be embedded, for it to be for it to be widely endorsed within a population. It must be widely regarded as legitimate by others. It must enjoy this first order endorsement, which thereby generates legitimacy. Okay, so that's the idea of a culture of trust. And I should also just say, by way of a background comment, I said halfway through that I'm not really going to engage in the definitional question of what trust consists in here, but there is a background presumption which is actually the thrust of the book that Chris alluded to, which is that trust in normal circumstances, the normal form of trust is one in which my trust is rationally proportioned to the evidence for someone else's trustworthiness. And this is a very deep debate around the nature of trust. Many people will take it to be characteristic of trust that it in some sense goes beyond the evidence for trustworthiness. The picture of trust that I'm working on here is one in which the normal form of trust, except that there are exceptions to this, but the normal form of trust is one in which we trust according to the evidence. Okay. So how does the law promote a culture of trust? So I'm just going to consider the two theses in separate, how the law promotes a culture of trust, and then conversely how culture of trust promotes the rule of law. So I'll be relatively quick on the first. I mean, the most basic point is that law, when law is widely enforced, widely followed, and that's the sense in which I'm using the term the rule of law here. So within legal discourse, there's a much richer definition of that and a debate about what the full demands of the rule of law consist in. I just want to acknowledge that, and I'm just using it in this very thin sense about widespread compliance with the law. The most obvious feature of the law is that it reduces the costs of betrayal. So if someone else reneges on some kind of commitment that they have to me, it's likely that the penalty, rather the cost that I will incur as a result of that betrayal will be lesser than it otherwise would be. So Samuel Bowles remarks, in most of human history, quotes, strangers represent dangers, not opportunities for mutual benefit. And I think the first function of the law is to change that calculus, in reducing the dangers that strangers impose, so it increases the opportunities for mutual benefit. Now, I think there's also a subtler way in which the law promotes a culture of trust. And this is that it encodes in its structure the ideational conditions of a culture of trust. So what it does, it teaches us to reason practically in ways that enable us to sustain a culture of trust. And we can see this just by considering the four features that I've picked out as definitional of a culture of trust, which is that the law is deontic, it's trumping, it's universal, and it assumes public legitimacy. So it requires that you comply with it. It requires that everyone should comply with it. It requires that compliance with it should be the most important thing. It's not just a factor in the set of considerations. It's the most important consideration we have. And it assumes public legitimacy, that everyone within its jurisdiction will comply with it. And I think this is unsurprising that the law should have this. It's not just a coincidence that the law has these four features. And in particular, this is unsurprising if HLA Hart's account of the emergence of law is correct, which on his account with primary and secondary norms, the function of the law is simply to formalize social norms and to resolve some problems with their application, in particular unclarity regarding what the content of their requirements are. And so it's just no surprise that the law should have these same features of norms, because it simply is a formalized version of norm. And the consequence is that the law habituates individuals into practical reasoning regarding fundamental principles of cooperation in ways that are characterized by these four features. And I think and that's the kind of primary means in terms of practical reasoning, that the way law supports a culture of trust. I think there are other features as well of the law which promote which conduce to the increase of cultures of trust. And one of the most fundamental ones here is that the law is able to expand the context in which social rules can be relied upon. So what do I mean by this? I think in a pre-legal social environment, cooperation is bounded to the social group. We have habits of cooperation amongst those people, which we have existing patterns of cooperation with. We have the Dunbar number of 150 people or so forth. Like whatever the extent of existing cooperation is, that defines the basis on which social rules can be relied on. And very often, it's precisely distrust of external groups which makes cooperation within the group powerful and necessary. But as a consequence, trust across social groups just historically has been very hard to achieve. And what the law does is, by establishing jurisdiction across relevant social groups outside of existing patterns of cooperation, it establishes new patterns of generalized reciprocal compliance across such group boundaries. And it thereby gives me assurance that non-kin strangers are already in a relationship which is characterized by reciprocal cooperation and so forth. So I think that's a secondary mechanism by which law promotes cultures of trust. Okay, let me move to how cultures of trust promote compliance with the law. So there is a simple sense in which compliance with the law just is a matter of trust. So if many people view the law as only conditionally binding, so in the sense that I should obey it if and only if most others do, then it's just a condition on my compliance with the law that I must trust that most others will also comply with or obey the law. And this is a very thin sense. It's not the sense that I'm focused on. You will often hear people say, when people kind of rhetorically ask, the rule of law depends on trust, this is often what they mean by it. But I think it's quite a thin sense, and I think not very interesting sense. Although what I would point out from that is it shows that compliance with the law is a dynamic fact. So one person's non-compliance has indirect effects on others' compliance. It undermines the basis for others' compliance if they're reasoning in that conditional way. But I think the law relies on trust in a more complex way. So to show this, note that the law depends for its exercise on many people acting in support of it, not principally or directly out of a fear of sanctions, but because they regard doing so as their duty. So compliance with the law is directly supported by the deontic trumping universal mandate to treat others fairly, and it's indirectly supported by the same. And this mandates a kind of penumbra, as I call it, of extra-legal supportive actions and attitudes. So why does the law need this support? Why does it need? Why could we not get support for the law, compliance with the law, solely out of incentives? What I'm saying is that compliance with the law needs internalized attitudes which support it as well. Well, some forms of support for the law are costly. So for a police officer, there might be personal risk in carrying out their duties. For citizens giving evidence in trials, there might be a risk of reprisals from gangsters. There might be personal risk in a citizen's arrest. There might be accusations of snitching, or just minimally there's time involved in reporting an incident or giving evidence. And all of this is subject to a collective action problem, which is that the benefits for me as an individual of carrying this out are far exceeded by the potential costs that I may face. Even though collectively as a society, we rely on people incurring these costs for the public benefit of widespread compliance with the law. So the rational individual, rational in that specific sense, economistic sense, does not incur these costs. The one who internalizes the duty to comply with and support the law, by contrast, does. And I think in addition to this, and perhaps most significantly, the reputational cost of law breaking occurs only if it is publicly regarded as wrongful to break the law. And this is a very significant part of the penalty of law breaking. The penalty of law breaking consists not only in the penalty itself, but also the reputational cost, being discovered as a lawbreaker, as a criminal. And this cost, this reputational cost, fundamentally depends on internalized pro-law attitudes. So conditional cooperators comply with the law. So this discussion has been structured by this distinction between conditional and unconditional cooperators. Conditional cooperators comply with the law and enforce it only if they're assured that sufficiently many others have the required normative attitudes. And this is where norms of trustworthiness matter. Erosion of norms of trustworthiness undermine the assurance that sufficiently many others have the required normative attitudes, which commit them to treat others fairly. So this commitment to treat others fairly motivates both norms of trustworthiness and compliance with the law. An undermining of norms of trustworthiness gives me evidence that this commitment to treating others fairly is no longer widely held. It gives me evidence, therefore, that the rule of law is not based on the internal attitudes which are required, which I've argued are required for it to be sustained. This undermines compliance with the law directly, and it also undermines what I've called the penumbra of buttressing attitudes and actions. And as a result, cultures of trust are, I've argued, an independent source of influence on compliance with the law. Okay, so let me just turn to conclude. And what I advertised just at the start, I think social trust, a culture of trust, is an independent goal for policy and law. I think concern for a culture of trust is properly a public concern. So this is not just, so there's much public discussion about trust, and actually having worked on it for a number of years. So I started working on trust in about 2008, just in the wake of the financial crisis. And then in 2009, for those of you who follow British politics, there was a parliamentary expenses scandal where a very significant number of MPs were caught having claimed for expenses that they weren't properly entitled to. And recurringly at this time, there was an anxiety, a public anxiety about a loss of trust. And there might be an initial response, which is something like, look, I know it's nicer to live in a neighborhood where you can leave your door unlocked, but the modern world isn't like that, and we just kind of need to get on with it. And it's just a sort of personal cost as a result. But I think that understates the significance of a culture of trust. I think it's actually a fundamental constituent of a flourishing society, but also a constituent part. I think it's also a public concern. It's properly a public concern. It's a component of the common good which the law ought to promote. And I just want to sort of raise the question, the possibility, or the possibility exists that the achievement of conditions of trust might trade off against other public concerns which we're properly pursuing. And one particular one that might be relevant is justice. So Rawls famously argued that justice is the first virtue of a society, of the basic structure of society, and that seems absolutely correct. And then the question that follows on is, what are the conditions under which this is sustained? And if the rule of law is a fundamental component part of a just society, and cultures of trust are required for this, then it looks like cultures of trust are in some sense a precondition of a just society, and we may be seeking to achieve justice, we thereby enable the seeking of justice, but there may also be principal constraints on how we seek justice insofar as it undermines a culture of trust. Now, that's in very loose terms. Maybe we can come in discussion to think about that. But I just want to note the possibility of trade. Anyway, without further ado, I'll stop there and look forward to questions and discussion. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed. Tony, you have given us a great deal to think about and discuss. Can I encourage anyone who has a question or would like to raise a point for discussion, either to raise your hand in Zoom or to put a little one-line note in the chat, and then I will know that you've done that, and I will call upon people in the order that happens. As people are thinking about what to ask, Tom, I think you very eloquently proved that you are trustworthy in two ways. First of all, by correcting me that you're not yet a professor, to somewhat to your own immediate sort of reputational costs in a way. You didn't have to do that. And secondly, by fulfilling your commitment to this seminar while you're on holiday at no doubt some considerable cost. So I feel vindicated in my judgment that you are trustworthy. Um, if if there are no questions coming in by the time I finish this next sentence, then I will ask one of my own and give other people a little moment to gather themselves. My question, Tom, is sort of a cantankerous one in the sense that I just want to test the extent to which a functioning society does actually rely upon trust by putting to you a situation where it might not and asking you what you think of it. So, do you think you can have a society where everyone consistently acts in an untrustworthy way and where everyone defaults, therefore, to mistrusting everybody else? Because you would have in such a society a set of expectations and conventions that would reliably be fulfilled, which sort of act in a very strange way like a social contract, as it's usually conceived. So if I think that other people will certainly not comply with the law unless they're forced, there's a sense perhaps in which that increases my respect for the law on one level, because at that point, the law's the only thing that stands between me and their brute will. So what makes a society possible, therefore, if this is true, isn't trustworthiness, but it's predictability. Whether it's predictable trustworthiness or predictable untrustworthiness. And so a contract of sorts among reliably untrustworthy people is possible. And of course, a social arrangement among people who are consistently trustworthy is also possible. Now, they'd be very different sorts of societies, but perhaps a society would be possible in both cases. And what can't act as a basis of society is a group of people who are intermittently trustworthy or inconsistently trustworthy. What do you think of that scenario?
Okay. Thank you. So, just so I understand it correctly, uh, is the idea that people comply with the law in this scenario to a reasonable degree, even though outside of the law they can't be trusted?
They comply with the law only because they are forced. They don't want to, but the heavy hand of the law compels them at some point. So although they are untrustworthy, there comes a point where they are bludgeoned into conforming with the law reliably and predictably.
Yeah. Yeah. So my kind of the thought I'm trying to articulate and argue for is that there will be principal constraints on that scenario arising, and that the law itself will be unstable in a situation where the only reason that people comply with the law is the fear of the law. There needs to be some other supplementary requirement. What I've called these internalized attitudes, commitment to treat other people fairly, which then in the for the law then recruits to support compliance with the law, so that you're going to have so I can see a scenario where, if you took the world as it actually is, and then, as it were, people's hearts were suddenly changed, so that everyone then made the decision to comply with the law only when it was rational to do so, only because they feared, only when it was prudent, only when they feared the consequences. You, it would kind of carry on for a little bit, and then gradually you'd see a withering and an undermining of that. And why is that? Well, so one is that the actual enforcement of the law would steadily degrade, so that all the instances of enforcement of the law that require people to go out of their way to make provisions, make contributions to the public good, which in the ways that I articulated would disappear. But I think, and you'd also see, so the administration of the law is itself an absolutely key element of the rule of law, which for those who are practitioners, this is just completely kind of the bread and butter, which is how do we make sure that we have police officers who aren't corrupt? How do we make sure that we have judges who aren't corrupt? And if the only factor that keeps them complying with the law is fear of sanctions, suddenly you'll see opportunism arise as a result of that, and the administration of the law breaks down. And then around that sits this question of the reputational consequences, which depend on these internal attitudes. So we live in a society. I mean, you referred to sort of current events right now, and particularly political landscape in America is right at the forefront of people's minds. And one perspective on that would be we're seeing the testing of whether it is shameful to undermine the rule of law and to break the rule of law.
Mm.
And if it turns out no longer to be publicly shameful to do so, that is the strongest indication that we're going to enter into a situation at some point in the future where the law ceases to be a genuine constraint on people's actions. So I forgive my sort of lack of, I plead my status as an analytics philosopher here to be ignorant of the history, but I'm embarrassed to do so. It's someone significant said, the law is a wax nose ultimately. That you get the law as a society that reflects the prevailing attitudes of that society, and ultimately shifts in those prevailing attitudes will inevitably change the law that's expressed. So law has a genuine constraining influence, but ultimately it's downstream of the internal attitudes. Those same attitudes being ones that sustain a culture of trust.
That's incredibly helpful. Thank you. And certainly no need to apologize at all. That was very thought-provoking answer. Stephanie has a question.
Hi, thank you so much for that really interesting talk. I'd love to just follow up about sort of your answer there. It was super interesting. So you were mentioning that law is a creation of the attitudes, the prevailing attitudes of interaction in society. And so I was just wondering about the importance of actual trust versus sort of superficially created trust in sort of creating that culture of trust. I would presume that perhaps having sort of superficial guise of trust would be less successful in creating a culture of trust. But I was just wondering about your thoughts on that.
And thank you very much, Stephanie. And could you just say what, or could you illustrate maybe the distinction between actual trust versus superficially created trust? That'd be really helpful.
Oh, yeah. So actual trust would be sort of theoretical circumstances in which people do actually take those norms of cooperation and justice in interactions sort of onboard themselves into their moral deliberations, whereas perhaps in a superficial culture of trust, people don't do so as regularly. So there might be violations where people act against that culture of trust, but perhaps they're made to feel like it's just them that doesn't feel like that, or they're sort of hidden under the rug, or something like that, where it's we could sort of imagine the government, for example, putting forward this sort of message to the public as in everyone does trust each other. Don't be that one person that doesn't, or something like that, trying to sort of artificially enforce this idea that everyone does trust each other.
Mm. Yeah, okay. Yeah, very, very interesting. So I think there can definitely be instances of, if you like, manipulated trust or a kind of constructed trust. And so there's one there's one so there's one of the illustrations given in a book on trustworthy explaining social norms is urinating in the swimming pool. So we take it it's like a bad thing to do, but maybe quite a lot of people do it. And so suppose therefore you shouldn't do. So there might be a kind of constructed pattern of behavior that relies on a certain representation of facts, and that representation of facts may be false as and not true to life. But interestingly, you may actually, I mean, it may be possible to bring about this kind of this kind of structured norm. And potentially quite a lot of the COVID messaging around that might have worked like that, which is there's a declaration. We take it to be for public health. It's clearly motivated for positive reasons, but there's a declaration that this is how the majority of people are behaving, and therefore that most other people are likewise behaving in that way, that actually cements and helps inculcate a regularity of behavior. I think that rash, sort of, if you like, actual trust will be stable when it's one of the features apprehension of either the other individual person's trustworthiness or the baseline rates of trustworthiness in relation to that norm, which I'm now trusting in a general way for other people to comply with. So think about tax compliance. So if it's just generally true that 95% of people, 97% people pay their taxes, then in that sense. So I don't know if that fully answers it, but yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So I wonder if I might pose another question, if I could. No one else has yet raised a hand. Is Karen? Karen, are you raising a hand?
Well, after you. I don't mind.
No,
You go
please.
ahead.
I've already asked one, so I will gladly see.
Because the question I'm going to ask is actually like strip some things down to the foundations. So look, thanks for that talk. And what I want to do is channel Annette Beyer, right? Because I think there's a sense in which you're idealizing what law is and what law does, and possibly also idealizing what it takes to acquire a commitment that makes these connections look simpler than they are. And so, going right back to Annette Beyer's comment, for which I have a lot of sympathy, because I don't think trustworthiness is a virtue, and I don't think it has this deontological flavor, but it's largely from thinking about these kinds of cases, right? We're talking about like the trustworthy wife would submit to patriarchal conceptions of the law, right? And precisely then what that woman should do is like busted apart, right? So you started from examples in terms of your theorizing about like clear cases of corruption where the law is fitting together with our ethical conception, and it can give rise easily, and then a commitment account of trustworthiness, but a commitment account of trustworthiness will only work if you do roughly what Hawley does, which is be able to acquire commitments really easily. And on her view, I sort of think of them as like Post-it notes that someone could stick on your back, right? Because you're not allowed to just, flick them off. And if that's true, you can acquire commitments in virtue of the set of norms in which you are living, where those norms in which you are living are deeply unjust, including all the commitments that the wife of the patriarchal husband, to refer back to Annette Beyer case, like keeps sticking on you, right? And then the law will, as you say, it's a wax nose. I hadn't heard that phrase before. It's downstream of all this stuff. And so I guess the question that I'm worried about is this easy connection, which maybe it's not easy, maybe it's not intuitive, you're right. But this close connection between the law and between trustworthiness presupposes some kind of normative control over your commitments, or at least not a toxic normative environment that sticks commitments like Post-it notes on you when you want to say, no, these are commitments coming at me from the law of the fathers, and stuff that, right? And do you see where I'm coming from? So I don't know. I mean, it's really trying to drill down to some of the presuppositions, which often come from your focal starting point examples. And you and Annette, for example, have very different focal starting point examples, because you have the corruption of politicians, and we all agree that was corrupt. And Annette has, the patriarchal husband trying to impose the conditions of the patriarchy, along with its commitments that the wife is not able to flick off, and so she gets trust busting. And we can add the law to this, because the law, as you say correctly, as it actually works, as opposed to as it's idealized. In some moments you sounded like you were kind of doing mid to maybe even extreme tier idealization of the law. It mostly follows through with those, which is why hardly anybody who is raped gets a successful conviction, and why women had no property rights for so long. So talk to Annette, and I'm ventriloquizing her and tip of the hat to Annette, who I did get to meet, who's now dead. But she kind of started this mess philosophically, so I want to channel her and bring her into this conversation.
Yeah, of course. Thank you very much. And I don't know if you picked up, but I think my Wi-Fi was just dropping in and out during the early part of your question. So forgive me if I don't pick up everything.
Should we switch our videos off so you're getting less to like?
I think we're good. Yeah. So great. So I think the point you make about, if you like, the presupposition or the premise of the discussion is really precise. So I take it that in Annette's work, who I never got the chance to meet, so she's focusing on trust in order to supplement, potentially supplant, what she would see as a hegemonic focus on justice, which, if I remember rightly, she says this is the I mean, she has not very complimentary phrasing. It's like gouty old men in the club, worrying about standing on each other's toes. And the concern for justice derives from free and equal individuals of independent means working out how to cooperate. And the ethics of trust arises as an issue because you have intimate relationships which are sometimes chosen under conditions of impaired choice, sometimes not chosen at all. And yet trust might be possible in some of these relationships. Distrust is also possible. And so the ethics of trust is when is trust morally proper, given this prevailing structure of social relationships, many of which are deeply imperfect, even unjust. And so she's then trying to define trust because she wants to address the question of the ethics of trust. So that's a very, very powerful critique, and as it were, is specifically thinking about trust in its personal relationship capacity, in its capacity of personal relationship. In relationships, obviously, which are informed by the law and are structured by the law, and it may be that the law plays particular ways of reinforcing particular kinds of injustice within parties, husbands and wives in particular. But well, I'm sort of questioning whether you'll come back with me. I was going to say, but in some sense, outside of the shadow of law at that point. Now, whether or not that's true, I don't know, but we can come back to discussion. But I think for me, the interest in trust is so when you look around the world that we inhabit now, the distinctive feature of it vis-a-vis the world of 100 years ago, certainly 300 years ago, is just the sheer scale of interactions that we have with people. And this kind of time in this call is kind of emblematic of that, some of us have known each other through our writings and work. Others of us, it's absolutely the first time. There's no encounter. And I mean, obviously the physical risk is low, but there are other forms of risk that have potentially arrived with this. And yet we all come into this with a sense of confidence, hopefully, of the kind of the upside opportunities. And I suppose I see that as a kind of triumph of trust in one sort of sense. And so that question of how and this is just a relational example of something that's happening in all sorts of other domains at large, more generally. So if you like, mass societies with large scale forms of interaction with people, which are definitely structured interactions, but structured in ways that where the personal relationship is not the driving factor that's involved. So I think for me, that's the kind of paradigm question that I'm trying to think about in relation to trust. And it may be that paradigm is then what shapes the account of trust that I give in the book, which is that it's normally a case of trusting those who are trustworthy. And then the interesting question is, how can this sometimes be a default mode of interaction as a result? So on the specific question, so I think what I haven't said anything to is the question of whether. So it's clearly the case that laws can be unjust, obviously, and so the question of complying with the law becomes sharp when the law mandates something that's explicitly immoral, explicitly unjust. And then there's other forms of law which, although not facially unjust, have the effect of reinforcing forms of injustice. And it's an interesting question. I hadn't sort of thought about it to the same degree with norms of trustworthiness.
There's
Sorry.
reverse, if we're going to take a net seriously, which is when you can acquire commitments such that your trustworthiness depends on fulfilling them, but commitment acquisition is itself unjust.
Mm.
So it can go on both sides. And that's the sticky post-it notes, and you can't flick them off, which I think is really in some of Catherine's work. You can't flick them off, but they just keep coming towards you, and they keep coming towards you because, and many of Catherine Hawley's examples are because you're a woman of a certain age who takes responsibility seriously. You can really, and like honor to her work, but you can hear the personal story behind that work. And that's why Annette Beyer also did not want to say that trustworthiness is a virtue. She wanted to say that sometimes we're required, so it's reciprocal again. Just as we might be required to engage in disobedience against the law, we cannot assume that trustworthiness is trumping deontic and so on, because sometimes we get these sticky commitments stuck on us unjustly, and it's Annette Beyer's phrase, we should engage in trust busting. So she's proposing a kind of, it's reverse on both sides, I think, channeling her.
Yeah, so I'm very cautious about saying that specific instances of law or equivalently norms of trustworthiness, the fact that they can be unjust undermines the idea that lawfulness or trustworthiness as such is a virtue. So what I'd rather say is it's a qualified virtue, or it's a virtue that is overridden in certain instances. That it becomes courage on behalf of the wrong cause is no longer courage. It's no longer a virtue at that point. But that doesn't mean that courage as such isn't a virtue. It just means that there's a qualification for the circumstances in which it's expressed. Do you not think?
I think, but I know it's a minority view that trustworthiness isn't a virtue at all, because the idea that there are circumstances that can be overridden is actually on a par with the kind of doctrine of the unity of the virtues, or the necessary compresence of the virtues. But I think other people probably want to come in. So it's really just like getting you to probe via channeling, Annette, that you could actually take both sides to probe whether the connection is as tight as it might seem, and whether trustworthiness is actually a virtue. And it's clear that those politicians did a bad thing, whereas the wife who subverts her husband's norms when he's perfectly happy to entitle the rearing and care of his children to her, is like, go you. Like, sometimes we want to trust bust. Yeah. That's really cool.
Great, thank you.
I've talked a lot. Okay.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much indeed, Karen. We have 4 minutes left. I've got one hand up. Michael, yes, please do ask your question, Michael. And if you could do it relatively succinctly, we'll still be able to finish on time. Thank you.
Sorry, it's not a great development of the discussion, but I was just really interested in what some of the sources might be here. I heard Sam Bowles' name. I hear some discussion of the social norms literature. I just was wondering to get a sense of who who's influenced this and who also you've rejected along the way. So I did my PhD thesis on Gerald Gauss's work. So I've read a bit about social norms, a bit about moral psychology. Been reading a bit of Sam Bowles lately. So I was just wondering who in the field you're endorsing and who you're distancing yourself from.
Yeah, great, thank you. So, I'm very happy to send you. I've got a kind of paper version of this, which I can send you with with all the relevant references. So I think so there's a philosophical literature, philosophical come social science literature on the concept of a norm and the nature of a norm, and obviously that's what I'm engaged in. So I haven't referred to Christina Bicchieri here, but her work is really influential for my thinking about the nature of a norm. Obviously, the primary literature which this has grown out of is the philosophy of trust literature, which Karen and I were just engaged in, with Annette Byer, Catherine Hawley being kind of key figures, Karen's own writing herself. So that's absolutely there. And I think the rule of law literature is not the primary one of concern here, because much of the content of that is concerned with much more demanding conditions on the rule of law. And actually the discussion we've just been having now around the relationship between the morality of the law and the requirements of the rule of law is exactly implicated in that discussion. So there is a strand of thought which I won't allude to it now, but it's just because I want to make sure that I get it correct. But absolutely, there are separate positions on the degree to which the rule of law requires that it be that the law involved be morally praiseworthy. And then what's less engaged here, but is absolutely in the backdrop, is that wider literature on the degree to which social order and norms of cooperation can be sustained only on the basis of incentives, like how far do incentives go, and to what degree we need other forms of motivation to get people to comply, to get people to cooperate rather. And the behavioural economics literature is obviously foundational there, which Sam Bowles is working within. Yeah, but very happy to send more.
Thanks very much. Need to check out the book.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Tom. We are rapidly running out of time. For those of you present in the meeting, I've just sent a link in the chat to the upcoming seminars in this series. This time next week, we've got Professor David McCourt from the University of California, Davis, who's going to be speaking about the subject Standing Up to Beijing and the Common Good, which is coming out of a book that he recently wrote. And then on the 29th, we've got Professor Douglas Guilfoyle from University of New South Wales, who's going to be speaking on the subject, the oceans as a commons, everyone's, no one's, or the public good. So if either of those seminars interest you, do please follow the link in the chat. But it just remains for me very sincerely indeed to thank Tom for breaking into his holiday time. Please thank pass on our thanks, Tom, to your family, who I'm sure have missed you for this hour, but we are very grateful indeed that you spent this time with us. It's been an incredibly rich exchange, and we will go away thinking about this, I'm sure, for a long time. So please join with me in thanking our speaker for this evening, Thomas Simpson.
Can I just say thank you very much for making the time to engage with the material. It's gratefully received. And Karen for demonstrating the book as well.
Read this book. There it is.
It exists.
It exists.
It has the merit of existence, which is no small thing.
Indeed.
Thank you very much. Have a good day. Bye.